The question came from my daughter, and I knew from the way she asked it that she had probably been thinking about it for a while. She said, "Dad, if this gets serious, are you changing your will?" I didn't answer right away, not because I was planning to give everything away. I hadn't even thought that far ahead. But sitting there with my phone in my hand, thousands of miles away from my kids back in America, I realized I didn't have a good answer. I was 67 years old. I had moved to the Philippines, and for the first time in a long time, I was seeing someone. I thought my kids would be happy for me, maybe surprised, maybe a little worried. I wasn't expecting them to start thinking about what would happen to everything I owned after I died. And if I'm being fair, I didn't handle that first conversation very well. I got defensive. I told my daughter I wasn't dead yet. I told her I was still able to make my own decisions. Then I said, "Can I just enjoy my life without everybody worrying about my bank account?" That didn't help. She got quiet. When the call ended, I sat there feeling like I had turned one question into a much bigger problem. The strange part was that 6 months earlier, none of this was even on my mind. Dating wasn't the reason I came to the Philippines. I know some people are going to assume that. Older American man moves to the Philippines, so he must have come here looking for a woman. That wasn't my story. I had been divorced for years. After the divorce, I dated a little back in the States, but I never really enjoyed it. I got tired of starting over with people. Where are you from? What do you do? What happened with your marriage? What are you looking for? After a while, I just didn't care enough to keep doing it. I had my own place. My kids were grown. I had a routine. I wasn't miserable, but retirement got quiet fast. For years, I had pictured retirement as freedom. No alarm clock, no boss, no Monday morning. That part was nice. But after a while, I realized how long a day can feel when you don't have anywhere you need to be. That's when I started thinking about living somewhere warm, where my retirement money would go farther. I told everybody it was only for a while. That's how I ended up in the Philippines. The first few months were mostly about getting settled. I learned where to shop, figured out transportation, got used to the heat, and tried foods I couldn't pronounce. It wasn't some big, exciting life. It was just different, and I liked that. Then I met her. I'm not going to use her real name, so I'll call her Maria. Maria was 51, and yes, there was an age difference, 16 years. But she wasn't some young woman barely starting her life. She had been married before, she had grown children, she worked, she had her own family and her own responsibilities. We met in one of the least romantic ways possible. I was trying to figure out where I could buy something for my apartment. I asked somebody a question. Maria happened to be nearby, and she answered it. That was it. No big moment. She helped me find what I needed. We talked for a few minutes. Then we went our separate ways. About a week later, I saw her again. This time we talked longer. Eventually, I asked if she wanted to get coffee. She laughed and told me she had already had 2 coffees that day. I said, "Then I'll buy you something else." That was our first date, if you can even call it that. We sat there for almost 2 hours. What I remember most is how easy it felt. I wasn't trying to impress her. She wasn't trying to impress me. We just talked. After that, we started seeing each other once or twice a week, then a little more. I didn't tell my kids right away, not because I was hiding her. I just didn't know what it was yet. But after a couple of months, Maria wasn't just somebody I had dinner with anymore. And that's when I made the phone call that started all of this. I waited until Sunday because that was usually when both of my kids had time to talk. My son answered first. My daughter joined a few minutes later. We talked about normal stuff for a while. Work, weather, one of my grandkids having a cold. Then I said, "There's somebody I've been spending time with." There was a pause. My son said, "Like dating?" I said, "Yeah, I guess you could call it that." My daughter asked how long I had known her. I told him a couple of months. Then came the questions. How old is she? Does she work? Has she been married? Does she have kids? At first, I thought it was normal curiosity. Then my son asked if I had given her any money. I said no. He asked if she had ever asked. Again, no. My daughter said, "Dad, we're not trying to upset you. We just don't know her." I understood what they were worried about. They had read the same stories I had. So I told them Maria had never asked me for anything. In fact, when her phone started acting up and I offered to help replace it, she turned me down. I thought explaining that would calm my kids down. It didn't. My son said, "That doesn't mean anything yet." That word stuck with me. Yet. Like they were waiting for something bad to happen. I got irritated and told them they were judging somebody they had never met. My daughter said they were trying to protect me. I told her I didn't need protecting. At one point, she even asked if I had thought about coming back to the States before things got more serious. I told her I wasn't planning on it. That was another mistake. Because the truth was, I probably did need people in my life who were willing to ask hard questions. I just didn't like hearing them. After that call, I stopped bringing Maria up much. I was tired of feeling like I had to defend the relationship every time her name came up. Meanwhile, we kept getting closer. We still had our own places, and we weren't talking about marriage, but she had become part of my normal week. If I got sick, she checked on me. If she had a rough day, she called me. It wasn't dramatic, it just felt normal. Then one afternoon, Maria asked me something that caught me off guard. She said, "Do your children know about me?" I said yes. She looked at me and said, "Do they like me?" I laughed a little and told her they had never met her. She didn't laugh. She said, "That's not what I asked." I knew right then that I had been avoiding something, so I told her the truth. I told her my kids were worried. I told her they had asked about money. I expected her to get angry. Instead, she nodded. Then she said, "If my mother was dating a foreign man I had never met, I would ask questions too." That surprised me. I asked if it bothered her. She said, "A little, but they are your children." Then she added something I wasn't expecting. She said, "You should not give me money just because we are together." I told her I wasn't planning to. She smiled and said, "Good." That should have made everything easier. For a while it did. But a few weeks later, my daughter called me by herself. And this time, she didn't ask about Maria's job or her age or how we met. She asked me a question I had no idea how to answer. She said, "Dad, if this becomes serious, are you changing your will?" I didn't answer her right away. I knew what she meant. My will was simple. My house back in the States had already been sold, so there wasn't some big property sitting there. What I had was savings, a retirement account, and a few things I had planned to leave to my kids. Nothing complicated. At least it wasn't complicated before Maria came into the picture. I told my daughter, "I haven't changed anything." She said, "I know. I'm asking if you plan to." I could hear that she was trying to stay calm. That made me feel worse because part of me wanted to snap back at her. Instead, I said, "I don't know." She got quiet. Then she said, "That's what scares me." I asked her what she meant by that. She said, "You've known her for a few months. You moved to another country. We barely know what your life is like over there. Now you're telling us this relationship is getting serious and you don't know what you're going to do with your money." I said, "That's my money." She answered, "I know it is." That stopped me. She wasn't demanding anything. She wasn't saying I owed her money. She was saying she was worried I might make a big decision too fast. And if I'm being truthful, I had done that before. Not with women, just in general. When I got an idea in my head, I had a habit of going all in. That was part of how I ended up in the Philippines. I had thought about moving abroad for a long time, but once I finally decided to do it, I moved fast. My kids knew that about me. My daughter asked one more question. If you married her next year, would you leave part of everything to her? I stared at the wall for a few seconds. I said, "I really don't know." She said, "Okay." That was all. No argument, no yelling. That somehow made the conversation harder. After we hung up, I kept thinking about it. If Maria and I stayed together for years, would it be fair to leave her nothing? But if I changed my will after knowing her less than a year, would my kids be right to worry? I had never thought about dating at this age in those terms. When I was younger, relationships were about whether you liked each other. Could you live together? Did you want kids? Could you build a life? At 67, there was another question sitting in the room. What happens when one of you dies? I didn't like thinking about that, but pretending I was 40 wasn't going to change my age. A few days later, I told Maria about the call. We were eating lunch when I brought it up. I said, "My daughter asked if I'm going to change my will." Maria put her fork down. For a second, I thought this was finally going to be the conversation where she got upset. She asked, "Are you?" I said, "I don't know." Then she said something that made me feel about 2 inches tall. She said, "Why would you change it for me?" I told her I wasn't saying I would. I was just trying to think about the future. She said, "Your children are your children. What you worked for before me belongs with your family." I told her it wasn't that simple. She said, "It can be." Then she picked up her fork and kept eating. I laughed and asked, "That's it?" She said, "What else do you want me to say?" I told her I didn't know. Maybe I expected her to say she deserved something. Maybe I expected her to tell me my kids were being rude. She didn't do either one. She said, "If someday we get married, then we talk about our life. But I am not with you because I am waiting for you to die." I didn't really know what to say to that. I felt embarrassed that the thought had even crossed my mind. Not because I believed she was after my money, but because I had allowed everybody else's fear to get inside my head. After that, I decided I was going to stop guessing. I wanted my kids to meet her, not on a video call, not through pictures, in person. I figured one of two things would happen. My daughter would finally see what I saw in Maria, or the whole thing would get worse. The problem was, my daughter had already told me she had no interest in coming to the Philippines. At least that's what she said at first. 3 months later, she sent me a message. "Dad, what month would be best for me to visit?" I read it twice before I answered. I didn't answer right away. Part of me was excited. Another part of me wondered why she had changed her mind. I called her instead of texting back. I said, "Are you serious?" She said, "Yeah, I think I should see it for myself." I knew what she meant. She wanted to see how I was living. She wanted to meet Maria. and I'm sure she wanted to make sure I hadn't lost my mind. We picked a month that worked for her job, and a few weeks later, I was standing at the airport waiting for my daughter to walk out. When I saw her, I realized how long it had been since I had hugged one of my kids. That part got to me. She looked tired from the flight, but she smiled and said, "Well, I'm here." I said, "You are." Then she looked around and said, "It's hotter than I thought." That made me laugh. On the ride back, she asked 100 questions. How far was the hospital? Did I drive? Was the area safe at night? How often did I lose power? What did I do if I got sick? I answered as best I could. Some of the questions made sense. A few annoyed me. But I had promised myself I wasn't going to spend her whole visit getting defensive. The first day, I let her rest. The next morning, Maria came over. I was more nervous about that meeting than I wanted to admit. Maria knew my daughter had concerns. My daughter knew Maria knew. So we all walked into that room knowing exactly why this meeting mattered. At first, it was awkward, very awkward. My daughter was polite. Maria was polite. Everybody smiled too much. I made coffee just to have something to do with my hands. Then Maria asked my daughter about her flight. My daughter asked Maria about her work. Little by little, they started talking without me forcing it. That was a relief. We went out for lunch. I expected my daughter to watch every little thing Maria did, and maybe she did, but nothing dramatic happened. Maria didn't order the most expensive thing on the menu. She didn't ask me to buy anything. She didn't hang on me or act like she had something to prove. She was just herself. At one point, I went to the restroom. When I came back, the two of them were talking without me. I couldn't hear what they were saying. Later, I asked my daughter about it. She said, "I asked her what she likes about you." I laughed and said, "That's a dangerous question." She didn't laugh. She said, "She gave a good answer." Of course, I asked what Maria said. My daughter told me, "She said you're calm, you listen, and you make her laugh." That was it. Nothing about money, nothing about America, nothing about what I could do for her. That seemed to matter to my daughter. Over the next few days, I showed her my normal life, not the tourist stuff. My grocery store, the place where I got coffee, the little restaurant I went to all the time, the route I walked in the morning. She met a couple of people I had gotten to know. She saw that I wasn't sitting alone in an apartment waiting for Maria to come rescue me. I had a life here. But she also noticed things I had stopped noticing. One night she asked, what would happen if I had a medical emergency and Maria wasn't around? I said I'd call for help. She asked who. I didn't have a great answer. Another day, she asked where I kept copies of my important papers. I told her they were in a drawer. She looked at me and said, "Dad, that's not a plan." I wanted to argue, but she was right. I had spent so much time proving to everybody that I could handle living in the Philippines that I hadn't thought enough about what might happen if I suddenly couldn't handle something myself. That was hard to admit, and it had nothing to do with Maria. By the middle of the visit, something had changed between my daughter and me. She wasn't trying to convince me to leave, and I wasn't trying to prove that every choice I had made was perfect. We were finally just talking. Then, 2 nights before she was supposed to fly home, she asked if we could sit down alone. I knew from her face that this wasn't going to be small talk. She said, "I need to tell you something about Maria." And for a second my stomach dropped. My first thought was that Maria had said something to her, something bad, maybe something about money, maybe something about me. I said, "What happened?" My daughter looked at me for a second and said, Nothing happened. That didn't help. She said, I actually like her. I just stared at her. I said, That's what you needed to tell me? She shook her head. No, I need to tell you that I think I was wrong about part of this. I didn't say anything. She went on. I came here expecting to see something I didn't like. I thought maybe she was pushing you into things. I thought maybe you were paying for everything. I thought maybe you were lonely and just didn't see what was happening. That was hard to hear. Even though I knew she had worried about those things, hearing her say it out loud was different. Then she said, I don't see that. I was relieved to hear that. She said Maria seemed genuine. She said she could tell we were comfortable together. She said she didn't feel like Maria was trying to take over my life. Then she added, But I'm still worried about you. I almost laughed. I said, Of course you are. She smiled. Then she said, Not because of her, because of you. That got my attention. She told me I had no real emergency plan, no list of accounts, no clear instructions if something happened to me. My important papers were mixed in with old receipts. My kids didn't even know the name of the doctor I had seen here. I had moved across the world and taken care of the big things, but I had ignored a lot of small things that suddenly didn't feel so small. Then she brought up the will again. This time, I didn't get angry. She said, Dad, I don't care if you spend your money. Travel, eat out, enjoy yourself. That's why you worked all those years. She paused. What scares me is you making decisions because you feel like you have to prove something. I asked what she meant. She said, You were so mad when we questioned this relationship that I think you started treating every concern like an attack. She was right. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. Every time one of my kids asked about Maria, I heard the same thing. We don't trust you. You're too old to know what you're doing. You made a mistake moving there. But that wasn't always what they were saying. Sometimes they were just scared. I was still their dad, but I was also getting older. That was something none of us really knew how to talk about. I asked my daughter, So, what do you think I should do? She said, Talk to somebody who actually knows what they're doing. That made sense. Not my kids, not Maria, not some guy at a coffee shop. A lawyer. Someone who could help me put things in order without turning it into a fight between the people I cared about. The next day, I told Maria about the conversation. She listened, then said, Your daughter is smart. I said, Don't tell her that. I'll never hear the end of it. Maria laughed. Then I asked her a question I had been avoiding. If we stay together and someday we get married, what do you expect from me financially? She got serious. She said, I expect you to be honest. I asked if that was all. She said, and I expect us to talk before we make big decisions. I kept thinking about that afterward. It was simple, but it made sense. We didn't need to solve the next 20 years that afternoon, but we did need to stop pretending money had nothing to do with our future. Money affects almost every relationship in some way. Where you live, who pays for what happens when somebody gets sick, what happens if one person dies first. Those weren't fun things to talk about, but they were real. Before my daughter left, the three of us had dinner together one more time. It felt completely different from the first lunch. Nobody was studying anybody. Nobody was waiting for the wrong answer. At one point, my daughter and Maria started laughing about something I had done earlier that day. I said, Great, now there are two of you. My daughter said, "You did this to yourself." It was probably the most normal moment of the whole visit, and I remember sitting there thinking that maybe this could actually work. Not perfectly, but honestly. The next morning, I took my daughter to the airport. Before she went inside, she hugged me and said, "I'm not asking you to come home." That surprised me. Then she said, "Just promise me you'll get your stuff together." I told her I would, and for once, I meant it. A week after she left, I made an appointment to start doing exactly that. The appointment was a lot less dramatic than I had made it in my head. Mostly, I got asked basic questions about what I owned, where my accounts were, who I wanted handling things if I couldn't, and whether I thought I might marry again. That last one made me stop. I said, "Maybe." It was the first time I had said that out loud. The main thing I took from the meeting was that I didn't have to solve every possible future problem that day. I just needed to get organized, make my wishes clear, and update things later if my life changed. So I went home and finally cleaned up that drawer my daughter had complained about. She was right. It was a mess. I put my important papers together, made a list of my accounts and contacts, and made sure my kids knew where everything was. It wasn't exciting, but I felt better when it was done. Maria came over while I was working on it. She looked at the papers covering the table and said, "Your daughter did this?" I said, "Pretty much." She smiled. I told Maria I was getting serious about making a plan and that I wasn't changing everything overnight. I wanted my kids protected, but if our relationship kept growing, I didn't want to pretend she would never be part of those decisions either. She listened and said, "That sounds fair." And that was enough. I had spent months imagining arguments that never happened. A few months have passed since my daughter's visit. Maria and I are still together. We don't live together, and we're not engaged. I'm okay with that. At my age, it's easy to feel like you have to hurry because you don't have 10 years to figure everything out. I don't want to make decisions just because I feel rushed. My daughter asks about Maria now. Sometimes Maria joins a video call for a few minutes. My son is still more cautious, but I don't get angry about it anymore. He can have questions. I can still make my own choices. I finally understood I didn't have to pick one side. I'm still glad I came to the Philippines. I'm glad I gave myself a chance to start over, and I'm glad I met Maria. I don't know if we'll get married. I don't know if we'll live together someday. We're just taking it as it comes. That question from my daughter still stays with me. Are you changing your will? When she first asked, I heard it like she was accusing me of something. Now I understand what she was really asking. Have you thought this through? At the time I hadn't, not enough. My kids know my plans now. Maria knows where she stands. And I feel better knowing I'm not leaving a mess for somebody else to sort out later. But after all the talk about money, that isn't what I think about most when I think about Maria. I think about having somebody to eat dinner with. I think about her making fun of me for wearing the same shirts all the time. I think about going somewhere and having somebody beside me who actually wants to be there. Those are small things, but after years of being alone, they don't feel small to me. I didn't come to the Philippines looking for a relationship. I just met somebody I liked spending time with, and one week turned into another. Maybe we'll get married one day. Maybe we won't. I'm not trying to figure out the next 5 years right now. My kids still worry about me. Maria still tells me when I'm being stubborn. And I'm still figuring things out. For now, that's enough. If you were one of my kids, would you have asked about the will too? I'd be curious to know.